I'm Eddy Malesky, a professor of political economy and the director of Duke University's Center for International Development. I'm the author of the Myanmar Business Environment Index, together with my colleagues Dean Dulé at Singapore Management University and Vil Pettivuri of the Asia Foundation. The Myanmar Business Environment Index is a massive project that included teams of researchers and data analysts. So before I start, I do want to thank our important partners, UKAID and the Dana Facility, for providing funding and encouragement and support, the Asia Foundation for managing all the logistics behind the project, and of course my own group, the Duke Center for International Development, for assisting with the research. Business leaders often say, before you can manage something, you have to be able to measure it. That is, before you can make strategic choices and come up with new policies, you have to have the data. And in this case, our case, the Myanmar Business Environment Index provides that data. It does it by aggregating the voice of individual enterprises into a larger voice that tells us what economic governance is at the national level, the state and region level, and township level in the country. So the Myanmar Index is part of a larger project called Economic Governance Indices that were designed by the Asia Foundation and used throughout the country. The goal is to measure economic governance as it's experienced by formal domestic firms in Myanmar services and manufacturing sectors. The ultimate goal is to benchmark states and regions and townships on critical factors that affect local business performance and survival. For example, entry costs, access to land, or infrastructure. What we want to do is create an index where we can see which places are doing well and performing well, so we can look to them for best practices, and which places have room for improvement and can benefit from learning those lessons. The ultimate goal is to help government, businesses, and stakeholders understand economic governance in Myanmar to foster reforms that address those specific challenges that are faced by businesses, creating a supporting environment that ultimately leads to economic growth and private sector development. Okay, so remember, one big common mistake that people make is they assume that economic governance can simply be measured by the size of the private sector, the number of private companies that they see operating. Because obviously a flourishing private sector must mean that things are good there. Of course, that doesn't always mean that way, right? So just think about some of the things that affect the private sector that aren't simply governance related. For example, we might just have a very dense population, or we might have a community that's very close to a port, or very close to a population center. All of those things create opportunities for businesses, but those are driven by the size of the market, not driven by the economic governance. It's possible to have a large market and still have room for improvement in governance. The MBEI is designed to put aside endowments and issues that affect the market size and focus simply on the things that affect governance, specifically policies that can be changed by local officials in the short and medium term. So to do that, we focus on 10 areas of governance, what we call the sub-indices. These range from entry costs to land access, to transparency, to informal charges, all the way to things like environmental policy and law and order. I'll give you a sense of those in a second, but there's 10 of them. These 10 sub-indices were designed from looking at international economics literature about what matters for private sector growth, but also from spending a lot of time talking with businesses, lawyers, and government officials in Myanmar about the specific constraints government officials faced. Now, each of those 10 sub-indices is comprised of indicators. These are the specific measures that we use to create those sub-indices. So for example, we might have a sub-index of entry costs, but within entry costs, we'll have indicators about how long it takes to get an operating license. Or for example, in our measure of regulatory costs, we might have a measure of how many inspections your business has. So how many inspections is an indicator, and the sub-index is cost of regulation. All right. So overall, within the index, we have 153 different indicators. 92 of those are what we call core indicators. Those are indicators that were measured in 2018 and then measured again in 2020. That allows us to compare over time. And then 61 are new indicators that we added this year. So after we looked at the report, talked to experts, talked to businesses, we decided to make some changes in the overall methodology of the index. To some extent, that was to capture changes that had already been happening in Myanmar and that the index needed to grow to keep up with economic reform in Myanmar. Some of those were just because the first index, we made some choices, and people smarter than us told us that we could make better choices. So, but we still want the index to be consistent. So that's why you'll sometimes hear me talk about the core indicators, which allow consistency over time, and the new indicators, which can't be compared because they're brand new. So now let's get to the final MBEI, the final Myanmar Business Environment Index. So we've taken the indicators and we've created each subindex. Then we've put the subindices together. But it would be a mistake to just add the subindices together and say the simple summation of all these indices is the index, because some of these subindices matter more or less for overall private sector development. So what we did is we used a technique called regression analysis to figure out which subindices were most important for employment growth over time. And then once we created that employment growth measure, we used that to weight the subindices. So for example, that a subindex accounted for 5% of labor growth, well, that's essentially what it got in the overall subindex. We used 3 different types of weights, low, high, and medium, and weighted them by their importance for economic growth. And that takes us to the final Myanmar Business Environment Index, right? So now, because we're adding them together and we're weighting by their importance, this creates an index that theoretically ranges between 10 and 100. But as you can see, 100 would mean that you did the best of all locations on every single subindex. We don't have anything like that. But you can see here, we have a range between overall about 50 points or about 55 points, and then close to 61 points overall for the overall index. One of the things that we looked at is we looked at a confidence interval. That is, if we were to rerun the index, if we were to rerun the survey 1,000 times, 95% of the time, what would be the range that we would find that overall score in? And we use that to create a confidence interval. You can see that with the range bars on the graph. When range bars overlap, it means that we can't tell whether one location is statistically better governed than other locations. So we use that to create tiers. We group tiers by those that they're statistically equivalent to. That allowed us to identify 4 tiers. So what you can see here is the high tier that includes Yangon, Sagaing, Naypyidaw, and Bago. A second tier, which is statistically lower than that, but just slightly, Magwe, Mandalay, Irrawaddy, and Kaya. A third tier of Kachin and Kayin, and then a fourth tier of Mon, Rakhine, Tanintari, Chin, and Shan states. So I think there's a few things to notice about this. There is no statistical difference within tiers. That means if we change the weighting or change the methodology a little bit, that states and regions might move within their tier, but they won't move across tiers. They're pretty robust. So when we say something is relatively high performing versus low performing, we can feel confident in that. Looking specifically at the high tier, you can see that there's sort of the high and medium tiers. There's 2 different ways to overall good governance in Myanmar. There's kind of an urban approach, which is good labor recruitment, high levels of transparency, high levels of infrastructure. And then there's another approach, that's an approach that's used by Yangon, Naypyidaw, and Mandalay. A third approach that you see in Sagaing, Bago, and Magwe is what might you call the more rural approach, which is these places have less regulation, easier business entry, easier access to land, and less informal charges overall. So those are the sort of 2 different routes to overall successful governance. Here, just to give you a sense of the overall map of business performance in Myanmar, you can see that we do see some clustering of high performance areas overall in the country, and lower performing areas tend to be out on the borders. One thing that we might see is that this, as we look, it might be because of diffusion of best practices, or it might be because of underlying historical conditions. So now you know how we create the index. Now, how do we measure change over time? Well, essentially what we do is create the exact same index, but we do it only for the core indicators, only for the ones that were measured in 2018 and in 2020. And then, to be even extra careful, we only use the panel firms. That is, we ask the same firms about the same questions in both 2018 and 2020. And the difference in their perceptions and in the observational indicators is what gives us the change over time. So first of all, we create that core index. And as you can see, there's really good news here. The core MBEI has risen 5.4 points from 55.1 in 2018 to 66.6 in 2020, almost a 10% overall improvement over time. And that's good. That means generally businesses are experiencing overall better governance in Myanmar over time. Now, the performance has varied a little bit. We see positive and significant improvements on 6 indicators, but 4 we're not seeing much improvement. So the 6 areas where we're seeing positive improvement over time are post-entry regulation. There's less burdens after businesses start their regulations. Infrastructure has significantly improved over time. Transparency has improved. Businesses have better access to information. They see less favoritism towards other businesses, and environmental compliance is getting better, along with labor recruitment. On the other hand, we're not seeing significant changes in entry costs, land access, informal charges, and law and order. So those are all areas where overall there's room for improvement, and in Myanmar as a whole. Which areas have done the better? Well, you can see here we measure the change over time. That triangle gives you the 2018 score, and the circle gives the 2020 score for each state and region. The places that improve the greatest over time are Irrawaddy, Yangon, Sagaing, and Naypyidaw. These are places where the same individual businesses have seen improvement on the same individual indicators over time. The smaller areas where there's less of a gap between the triangle and the circle indicate places where governance did not improve as much between the 2 years, and where there's opportunities to take best practices from those who have been able to improve their governance more. All right, so thank you for paying attention all this time. I think there's just so much here, and there's just not enough time to go everything through the index. But I did want to conclude with some final thoughts. I really hope that you understand at this point that the MBEI is an incredibly powerful tool that can be used to benchmark Myanmar's reforms at a national level, state and region, and township level, and can be used by government officials, businesses, and researchers. Now, we document improvement over time on the index, but there still is a lot of room for improvement. Even the very best states and regions are still only scoring 60 out of a score of 100. Transparency of business information is probably the most critical reform of all. It has a high weight in the index, and overall transparency is quite low. There's a high payoff, and it is really low-hanging fruit to simply provide easy access to information. And finally, in terms of our own transparency, we've only given you a small snapshot of what's available in the overall index. And so I do hope that you visit our website and download the data and look at the graphics and play with the gizmos to be able to do analyses of your own on key indicators and key reforms that you care about the most. And of course, we're always available to help you along the way. Thank you so much.